welcome to the Podish-Sortacast, our occasional, almost never on time podcast about whatever we're sort of thinking about on the network itself. I'm H.J. Hornbeck of Reprobate Spreadsheet, and I've got a couple of people with us today, but as an intro, the genesis of this episode itself actually dates back a couple of months. It was NU of Polite Conversations on one of our podcasts was complaining that a lot of people within the atheoskeptic sphere were really not sort of dealing with or talking about the conflict within Israel and Palestine, how it was playing out and all that, and really sort of again sort of took people to task for it. Uh, a lot of the people. A lot of people like Sam Harris or the right sort of portion of that were just far more vocal and spreading all sorts of misinformation and lies. And, the silence of, more liberal people on the subject really was sort of disquieting her. And I mean, it sort of kept gnawing at me, and I kept meaning to sort of blog about it and all that, but never really sort of had the time or energy to. PZ, for his part, actually kind of has a little bit, but um, again, I still felt, even months later that, okay, this is something that's undeserved, and it's something that we should talk about. And so I have, I've proposed it as our topic for today. Now, to help me talk about the subject as well as I've sort of alluded to is PZ Myers, of course, PZ Myers of Ferengula. Might as well give yourself a quick introduction there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just a guy with a blog, so I'm the host of Ferengula, and I'm here because I have free time. It's my spring break. It is my birthday, so this is my birthday party, which really kind of sucks. And I have strong opinions on this stuff, and I've become increasingly radicalized in my opposition to Israel, especially since we've witnessed their response to the October 7th atrocities.
All right. Excellent. We'll get more into the social stuff later on. Social media contact bubble. We've also got Abe Drayton with us as well too. Abe, do you want to do an introduction for yourself?
Sure. I'm Abe Drayton. I run Oceanoxia, which is a blog mostly about climate change, but also sort of the politics surrounding climate change, which means it's a blog about most things, depending on what catches my interest. Yeah, and I guess I'm probably in a fairly similar place to PZ on this, in that I have strong opinions about what's going on, some of which I've sort of I think I had one post shortly after October 7th. But I'm definitely part of the people who have been silent on this. And so, I am attempting to do better going forward. Yeah, I think that about covers it.
Okay, cool. Well, we can might as well get the ball rolling as well too. William Brinkman wanted to sort of chip in some thoughts as well, but wasn't able to attend. I don't know. Abe, do you want to get us started, or do you want to give William Brinkman the honors of starting off the discussion?
Oh, I guess I'll start quickly, just because I think William's going to take us in a slightly different direction, just from what I had to say, at least initially. And I think his is a direction that's worth considering pursuing. But basically, one thing that I wanted to say was that when I did put a sad little post out shortly after October 7th, part of what I had to say was that the occupation needs the status of occupation needs to end, because anytime you have that sort of dynamic of that power dynamic of occupier occupied, you're going to have people fighting for freedom, and that generally manifests in extremely ugly ways because people are desperate, and the most extreme are the ones who tend to act out for well, most extremely, I guess. But I'd noticed since then a lot of people talking about Why was it that people were calling for sort of a ceasefire just right away when it wasn't obvious at the time what the death toll would be? And that confused me a little bit, because it seemed pretty obvious right from the beginning that it was going to be absolutely catastrophic, um, because of just the nature of the situation, of the Israeli government being a very far right government, and how such governments react to a challenge to their power, for lack of a better term. And we're in another moment again. We've seen sort of supporters of the Israeli campaign talking about how, if they wanted to if they wanted to do an actual genocide, they could just do that. They could just nuke Gaza and, or pretend to ignore fallout for a moment, or they could just kill everybody all at once. And so it can't be a genocide because they're not doing that. And this is a matter of, we can know what's coming based on what we've seen in life. And so just like we knew that an overreaction was coming from the Israeli government after October 7th, based on what we've seen in history, we also can know with great certainty that the death toll we've seen thus far will be completely dwarfed by what is coming if the Israeli government has their way in continuing a blockade on Gaza. And I mean, it's not just the government. We've seen civilians at the Rafah crossing trying to block aid trucks. And so Gaza is now under siege with no supplies. And what that means is mass starvation and mass disease. And it's very similar to what we saw in Iraq after the first Gulf War, when, under Bush Sr., we went in and completely trashed the country and destroyed a huge amount of their infrastructure. And then through embargo, kept them from having the resources to rebuild. And we're blocking things like blood bags, because hypothetically you can you can break down the chemicals used to make the plastic for a blood bag and use that for a chemical weapon, and all these sort of weird pretexts which led to hundreds of thousands of children and other Iraqis dying. Basically in a misguided attempt to get the Iraqi people to blame Saddam Hussein and overthrow him, I guess. And there's something very similar coming in Gaza right now. And we know what's coming, and I've seen a lot of people trying to pretend otherwise, and it's a problem. I think it's very good that Joe Biden has said he's going to put up a temporary port in Gaza, because that could bring in enough food and medical supplies to stave off the sort of the second phase of this mass slaughter. But also, the U.S. government needs to stop providing weapons for the mass slaughter. Like, we can't just on the one hand provide the explosives that are used to destroy Gaza, and then just, I don't know, it's a little hard to fathom how this is happening. And I think part of what we're going to be doing today is going into the history of how we got to this point, both with sort of the history of Zionism in Israel, but also I think we probably want to talk a little bit about the history of things like the support for Zionism in the United States, and where that interlinks with evangelical Christianity and the whole sort of, I don't know, gospel of left behind, and the sort of the I don't want to say ancient, but very old and embedded Zionism of somebody like Joe Biden, who's been around basically since the beginning on this issue in some ways. I guess that's all I have to say for now. So.
Oh, cool. Had a nice contribution. Pizza, have you got any remarks you want to sort of contribute as well?
Sure. Yeah. Mainly what I've got though is anger. I'm really pissed off at what has happened and where it's going. That, once upon a time, if you'd asked me, about Israel, I would have given you generalities about, yeah, Israel has a right to exist, that that we have to support them in general, not support the genocide that's going on, but to support the fact of their existence. And recent events have made me question that even. Does Israel have a right to exist? Maybe not. I think HJ is going to go into the history of this, but following recent events, all you can feel is dismay and disgust at the way Israel has been behaving. For example, okay, we got to get this out of the way right away, because it's now required that we all say that the October 7th catastrophe was unforgivable, reprehensible, just a horrible thing. We are not going to be making any apologies for Hamas. That Hamas is bad, okay? So we got that clear. We're all done with that. But what greatly bothered me was after the October 7th atrocities, that we immediately started hearing from Israeli propagandists about how, oh, these babies were decapitated, that there were all these sexual assaults, that there was intentional policy of rape to oppress the people of Israel. And, none of that has turned out to be true. That there's a whole lot of false propaganda from Israel, which left me baffled because, yeah, the killings on October 7th were sufficient. They were enough to say, yeah, Hamas is in the wrong. This was an objectionable act that was carried out. And, so for instance, I was reading Jeremy Scahill's and what's his name, Ryan Grimm's article about the New York Times article that came out a short while ago, where there were all these stories about, for instance, there were two young girls that we will hear from the New York Times were sexually assaulted and abused before they were killed. And then when we read the more detailed accounts from the people who were on the ground, from witnesses, from relatives of the two young girls, we learned that, yeah, they were shot, they were murdered, but there was no evidence of the sexual assault. And so I'm sitting there wondering, this is horrific that these young girls were shot and killed. Why isn't that enough? Why do we have to inflate it all with all these horrific stories of abuse of a corpse and terrible things like that, that just, we're just there to inflame us further? And seriously, if you told me that these two young girls were shot by terrorists, I'm on your side. So why do you need to then go on and pad the whole story so much? Why has there been this ongoing rush to invent all these horrific terrorist activities when the actual facts are more than enough to justify opposition to Hamas? And it's clear that what's going on is that they're building a case for further terrorist acts by Israel as supposedly justified responses. And so far what we're seeing is that they are not justified, that they've just been carrying out these horrific attacks, military attacks on civilians, starvation and disease running rampant, hospitals being blown up, and there's no justification for that, that this is an uncivilized series of acts. So I have come to question, should Israel exist? Of course, I'm not speaking about the Jewish people of Israel. They have every right to exist. I would like to see them living safely somewhere. But Israel seems to be a colossal mistake. Now I'm going to get in trouble because I said that, right? That there's going to be people who are going to be furious that I would question the right of the Israeli state to exist. And I can't help it anymore. They seem to be a fascist terrorist state that only differs from other fascist terrorist states in that the United States is propping them up, that we're supporting them, that we're shipping them all these arms and enabling the activities they go on. Now, I know HJ is going to be talking about the history of Zionism and where this all came from and how Israel came to be. But where I am, I'm thinking instead about what is the future of Israel? What is that region going to be like 100 years from now? Because when you listen to the propagandists, they do not have a vision. They do not have a clear idea of what's going to happen in the future. They don't have any ideas about how to stabilize their region, how to provide for the people of Palestine as well as the people for Israel. That when you listen to them, you get the impression all they've got in mind is wholesale genocide. Let's kill everyone. That the future of Israel 100 years from now is that they will be dominating a wasteland of only Jewish settlers, and everyone else will be gone. And that's not a viable future. That's not going to get us anywhere. I mean, just the fact that if they do that, if they accomplish their goal of eliminating all the Palestinians or turning them into slaves for the Israeli state, they're still going to be left with the fact that they're located in the Middle East and they have a lot of neighbors who will hate them even more. So that's kind of a feeling of resentment about what Israel has done to date and concern that there is no vision for the future other than a desolation. That's not supportable. We can't, it's just going to get worse and worse at this rate. Right now, we're all questioning how can we support Israel when they've got all this murder and mayhem going on. And yeah, we got potential solutions like Biden building a temporary port so we can bring in aid. But yeah, we aid the Palestinians. What next? What's going to happen after that? If we feed the Palestinians and keep them alive and give them medical care, but we've still got this nation state that's sitting there determined to destroy them, what do we do? Again, I'm was trying to imagine that region 100 years from now, and I can't because I don't see any prospects of the future. Can we even imagine that region 1 year from now? What will it look like? I don't think people like Netanyahu are going to come up with any solutions. It's just going to get worse and worse, and we're going to go from crisis to crisis, and we're going to go to this escalating thing where we need to do ever more just to bring a little support for the humanity that's there. And without a radical change, I don't have much hope for the future. Okay, cheer us up, HJ. You must have something better to say, right?
Indeed. Oh, yes. But I mean, it's definitely worth sort of backing up what PZ kind of says there. The sort of questioning, what exactly is does Israel have a right to exist? Jews, of course, they totally do. That's not under question at all.
The people have a right to exist,
Yes.
I would argue. But
exactly, free and safe
the
from
state
persecution.
Well,
Yeah. And it also sort of ties into a lot of this is just sort of me sort of to track down, okay, well, how exactly did we get here and all that? And unfortunately, I did focus exclusively on the Israeli side for the most part. I apologize for that. there is often sort of a criticism that, people don't tend to pay as much attention to Palestinian voices within this. I'll try and actually incorporate some in. I've got some quotes from people who actually lived within Palestine themselves, so I'll definitely try and bring them up. But I mean, the sort of, if you actually sort of look at the current situation itself, there is really sort of a clear through line towards where the history itself came from. Benjamin Netanyahu is part of the Likud party. The Likud party was sort of the direct line from what's known as revisionary Zionism. And revisionary Zionism sort of got its roots within Zionism itself. So, you kind of have to start off with Zionism, work through revisionist Zionism, and then you do kind of get a good idea of where exactly we came from here. And if you're sort of going to be talking about those as sort of the origins of the current conflict itself, there's really two people who sort of stand out as being more important than the rest. One of them is Theodor Herzl. He's often called the founder of Zionism. The movement sort of existed to an extent before him, but certainly he gave it the term Zionism. He was its most vocal proponent, and pretty much more than any other single person, did the most to make sure that Israel, the state, sort of existed today. The other person to learn about is Zev Jabotinsky. He was a founder of Revisionist Zionism, a sort of a mini group within Zionism proper, which, as again I sort of pointed out, actually has direct ties to the Likud party and by extension Benjamin Netanyahu for how they sort of settle things in. I don't know how much time I'll have, but I'll start off with Herzl, since arguably he is, the more important one. Oh, and I did actually, part of the reason why I was late is I was just sort of making sure all my sources were in a row. If you actually check the description to this video, you should see some of the sources I used dropped in there. That's not a complete list, but it's a pretty good start. You'll get a pretty good idea for it. I'll also try and stick to using primary sources themselves. So, like Herzl's original work and academics who have looked at that in general. I'm not really looking for polemics or anything like that when it comes to these sorts of things. Anyway, quick sketch of Herzl. He was born in Hungary in 1860, I believe. Spent most of his time in Vienna, in Austria. Had a lot of German influence within his life as well too. He kind of bounced around a little bit, but eventually sort of settled on trying to become somebody in the humanities. He was very much a writer and a poet. He spent a lot of time sort of writing plays, working on books and novels and such, and sort of doing that sort of work to sort of get himself published and to generate some sort of revenue for himself. Originally, he was very much sort of on the simulationist side cap there. Assimilation in this case basically means the way to sort of get rid of discrimination against Jewish people, himself being a Jewish person, was to sort of blend in with the local population. Sort of come up with some hybrid of Judaism and the local thing themselves. Like Herzl himself was predominantly speaking and writing in German itself, but even though Hebrew was an option for him as well too, and that's just simply to sort of fit in and blend in. He was fairly privileged in and of himself, so he didn't have too much issues with that, but he was still sort of dissatisfied with it. And events in his life really sort of radicalized him a little bit. Based on his private diaries and all that, the event that really sort of seemed to sort of push him away from assimilation was Vienna in around the 1890s or so. There'd been a wave of immigration within there, which actually had sort of led to a rightward shift within their politics themselves. Christian groups who had sort of been fragmented into their little sects and all that decided to actually form a coalition and try and get some sort of political power within there. Now, Austria at that time, I think as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was not actually a democracy itself, but they did actually have cities and towns which held elections, and those people, you could be elected within there. And obviously within the city, you would have quite a bit of political sway. And so in the 1890s, this coalition of Christian groups pushed to try and take over city councilor seats and eventually the mayorship as well too. It was probably a good decade-long project and a lot, with a lot of ups and downs. And unfortunately, one of the main drivers they actually sort of used to sort of whip up the base and encourage voters to come up for them was to invoke anti-Semitism. Things were quite bad. Herzl's diary is just from this period has a long number of streams of Jewish people he was talking with in Vienna, sort of complaining about how their condition had been made so much worse by the uptick in anti-Semitism, and it really sort of disillusioned him with the idea that Jews would ever sort of fit in. And one day I think I think he was in France at the time, having some other things done. He got hit with a brainwave of, okay, I think I know actually the proper solution to this. He sat down, wrote, a big long pamphlet, and basically published as Der Judenstaat, if I can say it in the original German. Essentially, the Jewish state is the English translation of it. And it actually laid out an entire plan for it. And he really tried to go into detail on it. He actually was, okay, I know I'm going to get some objections. Here's the main objections, that I expect I'm going to get. Here's my replies to them. He also laid out quite a bit of detail about how everything would actually work itself. So going back to the arguments themselves, basically, I'm going to quote from Der Judenstaat directly right here. This, again, is an English translation done in the 1980s, I believe. So take that for what it's worth. He was, again, original German. Everything rational and everything sentimental that can possibly be said in the Jewish defense has already been said. If one's hearers are incapable of comprehending them, one is a preacher in a desert. And if one's hearers are broad and high-minded enough to have grasped them already, then the sermon is superfluous. I believe in the ascent of man to higher and yet higher grades of civilization, but I consider this ascent to be desperately slow. Skipping ahead. In principal countries where anti-Semitism prevails, it does so as a result of the emancipation of the Jews. In other words, not only was there no way to actually get rid of anti-Semitism, it was gradually getting worse over time. All the laws and all that had actually been sort of introduced to protect Jewish people, or, to sort of protect minorities in general from discrimination, actually were making things worse. And he's pointing out, in fact, that a lot of the worst anti-Semitism was happening within these countries that had these protections. Going back to Herzl again. When civilizations awoke to the inhumanity of discriminatory legislation and franchised us, this franchisement came too late. For we had, curiously enough, developed while in the ghetto into a bourgeoisie people, and we stepped out of it only into the fierce competition with the middle classes. The very impossibility of getting at the Jews nourishes and embedders hatred of them. Anti-Semitism increases day by day and hour by hour among the nations. Indeed, it is bound to increase, because the causes of its growth continue to exist and cannot be removed. Its remote cause is our loss of the power of assimilation during the Middle Ages. Its immediate cause is our excessive production of mediocre intellects, who cannot find an outlet downwards or upwards. That is to say, no wholesome outlet in either direction. When we sink, we become a revolutionary proletariat, the subordinate officers of all revolutionary parties. At the same time, when we rise, there rises also our terrible power of the purse. So essentially, no matter what Jews did, they were going to be persecuted. And this is simply because they did not have, they were not a majority within any individual country. There was nothing you could do to actually prevent this from happening. And so his radical proposal was, okay, if we can't do that, then Jews must get their own state. And again, he went into great detail on how exactly to go. I definitely recommend reading the translation of it. It's very easy to find online, if you sort of want to read exactly what his plan was. Just to sort of give a broad brush overview of it, he decided there would be sort of two main companies that would handle, two main organizations that would handle it. The first would be the Society of the Jews. This would be a coalition of Zionist groups who would actually go around the world looking for places for Jews to settle. They would sort of investigate the local conditions, see how favorable they were, and, if they thought it would be favorable, they would then sort of go and acquire the land. Once they had the land, they would also be responsible for splitting it up. Herzl was very sort of mindful of what exactly could sort of happen if you just sort of bought a giant parcel of land and let everything happen. So he proposed sort of like a centralized authority to control who would get the land and when, how it would be doled out, all that sorts of things and all that. The second part of his plan was something called the Jewish Company. Now, as you can imagine, these Jews leaving their various countries would cause a bit of a problem of what to do with the leftover, land and all that they had, their leftover possessions. They couldn't take it all, and certainly they couldn't take the land with them. And so the Jewish Company was born to essentially handle that. Jews who wanted to leave from their respective, European countries was to hand over their land to the Jewish Company, and the Jewish Company would then sort of sell that off. Herzl himself was worried that, doing this all at once might actually crash economies, so he wanted to sort of dole it out over time. So the Jewish company would just sort of basically become a land speculator, selling the land back to various countries. He thought actually this would lead to quite a bit of prosperity too. Countries where the Jews had left, their productivity would raise and they would be a lot richer. Likewise, when Jews sort of landed wherever they did, they would make and sort of enhance the situation as well too. And in fact, he did actually have a place sort of laid out for the Jewish state to land. Argentina. Now, okay, I'm sort of simplifying things a little bit. Let me actually turn it back to Herzl himself and sort of describe what he talks about for a Jewish state. Shall we choose Palestine or Argentina? We shall take what is given us and what is selected by the Jewish public opinion. The society will determine both these points. Argentina is one of the most fertile countries in the world, extends over a vast area, has a sparse population, and a mild climate. The Argentine Republic would derive considerable profit from the cessation of a portion of its territory to us. The present infiltration of Jews has certainly produced some discontent, and it would be necessary to enlighten the Republic on the intrinsic difference of our new movement. Palestine is our ever memorable historic home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. If His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we could in return undertake the regulation of the whole finances of Turkey. To sort of situate this in time, this is in 1890 or so, and at the time the Ottoman Empire was in control of the area of Palestine, so the Turks, essentially. Getting back to Herzl, we should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have a guarantee of our existence. The sanctuaries of Christendom would be safeguarded by assigning them to an extraterritorial status such as well known into the laws of nations. So those are the two main choices he did. And he very much made it clear that they would sort of take any parcel of land that was there. In fact, there was actually a point in, I think it was 1893 or so, that someone came to him with a proposal which became known as sort of the Ugandan proposal. Essentially, the British who were in charge of Kenya, one of their leaders there thought that they could use sort of an economic boost and all that, and things weren't sort of going well. And they noticed that there was a lot of, investment by, rich Jews into the area as well, too. So they went to their superiors and said, hey, why not give, these Zionists part of Kenya / Uganda and let them sort of settle there? And it was, after initially sort of being cool on it, Herzl actually, warmed up to it and pitched it to the rest of the group. He had actually formed like a council of Zionists at this time, basically bringing together Jewish groups from all around the world to sort of say, hey, what do you think of this? And they almost accepted it. There was quite a bit of, it really caused a lot of discord within there. I think even the Russian delegation, which just sort of walked out. A lot of Zionists were convinced that the only spot for them would be Palestine. In fact, in trying to sort of smooth things over for that, Herzl actually said, no, this is just a temporary solution. We're going to move into Kenya, we're going to set up our thing there, and then eventually we'll settle over in Palestine. And that sort of framing for it, and also sort of a promise to actually do like a proposal and actually sort of go in and do a survey of the land. Sort of was enough to actually get, I think it was about a 2/3 majority of the council to look into relocating into Kenya / Uganda. 2 years later, they did reject it, but again, sort of fairly narrowly. The majority of them were sort of for Palestine itself. But it's notable that, again, roughly half of the people within the Zionist organization here were actually fine with relocating to Kenya or Uganda. They were not fixed on Palestine itself. Again, Herzl sometimes actually did fixate on Palestine. And even then, when we're talking Palestine, there wasn't really sort of a fixed area necessarily. As I sort of mentioned earlier, he would pretty much take anything he could get in terms of that. So they're also looking at the Sinai Peninsula, which is currently part of Egypt itself. And I think they also had plans to maybe sort of extend to the east, what would be nowadays be Lebanon as well, too. All of those areas were considered, Palestine, and thus, in some sense, theirs. Okay, well, that was his proposal. And again, I'm glossing over a lot. I definitely recommend you go and sit down and read it yourself to sort of get the details. But it did run into two major problems. The first was the Palestinians. They had, at this point, they had been living there for 2,000 years. Things had been going great for them. They had their land sort of settled for themselves. They were sitting on the place. Why exactly would they just sort of up and sell their land to the Zionists themselves? Again, I do want to emphasize that Herzl was very much sort of, his preference was to actually sort of purchase the land and get it however it can. But certainly his desperation of seeing, the pogroms sort of happening within Eastern Europe and all that, especially Russia, did kind of, put a bit of a fire under him and kind of made him, look more into sort of bending his principles, anything to sort of protect his people, as it were. But this returns us back to Palestine themselves, and I've actually got a translation of a letter from the current mayor of Jerusalem at the time. This is in, I believe, 1899. So this is back to Herzl himself, and sort of talking about his plans for his and the Zionist plans for actually settling within Palestine themselves. And it reads, in part, it is necessary to count with reality, with the facts acquired, with the brute force of circumstances. The reality is that Palestine is now an integral part of the Ottoman Empire, and what is more serious, is inhabited by others than Israelites. This reality, these acquired facts, this brutal force of circumstances does not leave the situation of Jews in Turkey with a real danger to the situation of the Jews in Turkey. In other words, if they push forward with their proposal, it would destabilize the region and cause violence, typically between Christians and the non-Zionists in that region itself. In another letter, which he wrote a little bit later, the same mayor, I should give him a name too, Yusuf al-Kani, he said, "It is therefore necessary for the tranquility of the Jews in Turkey that the Zionist movement, in the geographical sense of the word, cease. Let us look for a place for the unhappy Jewish nation, nothing more just and equitable. My God, the land is quite vast. There are still uninhabited countries where millions of poor Israelites could be placed, who may become happy there and one day could be a nation. It would be perhaps the best, most rational solution of the Jewish question. But in the name of God, please let Palestine be left alone." Now, Palestine itself was mostly Islamic at this point. Islam had sort of arrived halfway between where the Palestinians had lived in the current time. But, there had been a lot of mosques and cultural sort of regions there, and the area is predominantly Muslim at that point. Nonetheless, there were still a lot of Jews there. Again, there was, because the Hebrew Bible, because the Torah had said, hey, this is your promised land, a number of sort of, heavily religious Jews had moved there, and had set up land, and generally were doing A-okay. The population, I think, at the time was about 5%, maybe 10% Jewish in some sense. But of the 5 to 10%, the majority of them were also opposed to the Zionist plan. These were, after all, European Jews who had been out of that region for, centuries, if not millennia at that point. And now they were just going to suddenly barge in and take their place against Jews who had been living there for centuries, if not millennia. It was just, not sort of taken well. There was a Jewish community also within Jerusalem as well, which wrote back to Herzl basically saying pretty much exactly what the mayor had said. Like, don't come here. You're going to make things worse for everybody if you do that. All right. The other problem that Herzl sort of ran into were European Jews. It turns out a lot of them actually didn't really sort of buy into his doom and gloom narrative. There's actually like a passage within Herzl's Der Judenstaat, where he's going over objections and all that. And he actually sort of admits, hey, discrimination actually is getting better. We've come a long way from the witch hunt and all that before. Things are getting better for us in some sense. And his argument against this is that, well, even though things are getting better, the Jews are going to be more sensitive to the anti-Semitism that happens. So even though things are getting better, it feels to the Jewish people that things are still staying the same. And thus, they're still going to feel, persecuted and, dispossessed and all that. And so it's just not going to fly. Another problem as well is because Herzl's plan required, vast resources and all that, he basically focused his efforts on sort of selling time and all that to sort of rich Western European Jews for the most part. They're the ones, after all, who had the cash. And in fact, he was acquainted with the Rothschilds of the famous banking name and all that, and tried to sort of press them for, hey, this is my plan. I'm pretty sure it's going to work. I just need, a cash infusion to sort of get it started and all that. And they just said, no, it's not going to work. And ironically enough, I think they even had like some parcels of land within there. But they were just like, no, this plan is not going to work. We're fairly content where they are. And you can imagine the richer sort of Western European Jewish population, they had sort of the wealth and capital to sort of be happy within their land. Assimilation was working out great for them, so they really had no sort of interest in coming over. Now, so that just fell flat within there. The other problem they noticed as well, too, is that Herzl seemed to have a very negative opinion of other Jewish people. In fact, a lot of his ideas actually pushed a lot of social Darwinism. To quote again from Der Judenstaat, opposition and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has survived such struggles and sufferings as we, the Jewish people, have gone through. Jew baiting has merely shrugged off our weaklings. The strongest amongst us were invariably true to their race when persecution broke out against them. But the Jews, once settled into their own state, would probably have no more enemies. As for those who remain behind, since prosperity enfeebles and causes them to diminish, they would soon disappear altogether. I think that the Jews will always have sufficient enemies, such as every nation has, but once fixed in their own land, it will no longer be possible to scatter them all over the world. The diaspora cannot be reborn unless the civilization of the whole of earth should collapse, and such a consummation should be feared by none but foolish men. Essentially, he very much thought that part of the reason why he was sort of one of his main arguments for allowing the land of Palestine to be bought up by the Zionists themselves was because he thought it would bring a ton of prosperity to the region. By placing the Jews within this area, it would sort of purify their character and sort of, make them behave sort of like Übermensch, essentially. Become stronger and all that, and become more prosperous and more capitalized. He actually wrote a utopian novel called Autenland, which sort of detailed this process, where he went to Palestine, it was all terrible. The Jews sort of grabbed the land for themselves, returned 20 years later, and there had been remarkable improvements. In fact, he actually talks, there's a line in there about the local population, like, okay, well, what happened to you guys and all that? And they're like, oh, it was great when the Jews came. They brought their wealth and all that with them. We were so advanced and all that. It made us so much better as a people as well. It's very much a sort of wild supremacist kind of view of, so the superiority of the Jews in and of themselves. And a lot of other people actually sort of picked up on that. As early as, pretty much the year that Judenstaat was released, other people were sort of critiquing it as, like, critiquing him, saying, like, holy cow, you are anti-Semitic. There's a novel, I think, published in 1908, in which the author sort of inserts a line in the paragraph saying, oh, I toured Europe, and it was great for me as a Jew. I really only ran into one anti-Semite. Unfortunately, that anti-Semite that I ran into was a Zionist. It really kind of, his views really kind of poisoned other Jews against the Zionist movement themselves. They viewed it as sort of partially anti-Semitic. Partly, to sort of vent his frustrations and all that, and to sort of prove their point, sadly. Herzl actually wrote an article called Mauschel. If the name Maus sort of twigs a little bit of a memory, it's got a different derivation. It originally sort of started off as Jewish people who really spoke bad German because of they'd mix it up with their own local languages and all that. But by the time of Herzl, it basically meant Jewish vermin. And in this, he actually divides the Jewish race into two distinct people. There's sort of the ordinary Jew, like an ordinary person, nothing special about him. And then there are these Mauschels, these Jewish vermin, who were greedy, who, hoarded their money to themselves, had no principles, would do pretty much anything, had pretty much all the attributions that anti-Semites at the time would attribute to Jews themselves. It was apparently, which he actually thought that the reason why they had been introduced and why, they hadn't really gotten rid of them is because there was some mixing of races between Jews and others. This had sort of introduced these, downtrodden Moshul into them. And they were sort of holding back the Jewish race as a whole. And he sort of finished off that essay with some chilling lines at the end. Moshul, watch out. Zionism could act as William Tell did in the legend. When Tell prepared to shoot the apple from his son's head, he had a second arrow in readiness. If the first shot missed, the second was to serve for revenge. Friends, the second arrow of Zionism is meant for Moshul's chest. In other words, get in line with us, or we're going to, strike back at you. And it didn't help that he would do such bullshit as after the Armenian genocide, he approached the Turks and said, hey, a lot of people think you're terrible people because of this genocide. Well, we'll actually help improve your public image if in return you give us a parcel of land for the Jewish state themselves. He was getting desperate to try and get some sort of land for that. And he was really sort of leaning into a lot of the stereotypes that people had about Jews in general. And as a result, it really didn't become very popular at all. Like, I think some of the estimates from this time sort of say that, maybe only 10 to 20% of the Jewish population actually sort of agreed with Zionism in general. Yeah, he just had huge issues sort of getting people involved. And it wasn't until well after his death that he actually sort of saw any sort of success with that. Now, I think we are, what time is it right now? We are, got about 10 minutes or so left for that. I could give you basically a short preface on Jabberwocky, but I mean, if anyone wants to sort of jump in and give some feedback on what I've sort of described so far, feel free to now. If only because then I can rest my voice a bit.
Yeah, well, I'm just kind of appalled at the casual brutality of colonialism. So you've got these people far away who look at a spot on the map and start carving it up for themselves with no respect for the people who actually live there. So Palestine was a diverse state with, Muslims, Jews, Christians, all living there, maybe a little bit fractious with one another, but still they'd reconciled to the situation. And the Jewish state was just kind of imposed on them and saying, okay, we're the boss now, and dominating everyone, including the native Jewish population. And it doesn't look any nicer when you talk about the Palestine situation, or you talk about Americans moving, Europeans moving into America and displacing the native populations there, or the British moving into India or South Africa. You shouldn't be able to do that, but if you've got power, you can force your way in and do it. And that's what they were doing. And speaking of South Africa, that's kind of where I see Israel going, is they're building an apartheid state, and there's one group that's dominating everything, and their eventual fate is going to be displaced and being forced to accommodate all the other populations that live there. That's the only possible solution that can arise from this situation.
Yeah. One book that sort of influenced my thinking on this is from a journalist who actually lived around the West Bank and all that. I'm blanking on the title. I had memorized it, but studying for this kind of blanked that all out. But essentially, when you say that they're creating a segregated state, they've had it created for decades at this point. Like, there are different papers between, if you're a Palestinian and an Israeli, and there are restrictions on your movement. This book itself centers around sort of a fateful bus crash in the West Bank itself. Essentially, there are no real playgrounds within the West Bank. The Palestinian authorities there essentially have sort of given Israel a blank check to come in and do whatever military raids they want. They are nominally in charge, but Israel can sort of do what they wish. And as a side effect of that, there really were no playgrounds within the Palestinian Authority themselves. Israel also controls all the borders around the West Bank itself, and they had, been starving the Palestinians of funds for decades and all that. So there's no money to maintain playgrounds or anything like that. So they're all in a terrible situation. And so what happened for kids within the West Bank is they would hop on a bus and they would drive across into Israel and go to the Israeli playgrounds, which were much better kept, much more elaborate, and all that. And on this day, they were coming back from the playground and all that, and they ran straight into a mining truck. Uh, the Israeli, there's an Israeli company that was mining materials out of the West Bank themselves, out of the West Bank, hiring Palestinians for cheap because, again, Israel had actually sort of, prevented them from getting any sort of stable jobs and all that, and made it very difficult to sort of work outside. And, sort of turned them desperate to work for pennies, essentially. And they would, hire these Palestinians to mine the ores for them, take it out, and then just keep the money within this company, which is owned by by an Israeli, a couple of Israelis, and keep the money for themselves, essentially sort of extracting the profit from the land. And well, ore truck and bus collided, resulting in a horrific crash. And the problem is because this was on a regulated road, it was very difficult to sort of get any sort of help within there. I think if I remember correctly, the first uh, ambulance to show up, it didn't come from the West Bank because they didn't really have ambulances. They didn't have the funds or anything. The first ambulance, I think, from the Israeli side showed up about half an hour later after the crash itself. But a lot of the other passerbys there realized how serious the situation was, and essentially just a network of random strangers just started throwing injured children into their cars and driving to every sort of hospital that was around. Well, the problem is, again, Palestinians within the West Bank were segregated, but for where they could go. Some were allowed to go into Israel, some were not. And so this meant that, sometimes you can actually have your kid go into a section of Israel which you could not follow. And so you couldn't even sort of figure out where they were. I mean, you didn't have access to a phone or anything to phone around and all that. And so you're literally just sort of, getting your friends to sort of go and look for these kids. It was just absolute chaos and madness. And it has been caused by decades of Israeli disenfranchisement of Palestinians, of enforcing an economic and, segregation within the country itself. And I mean, it's it doesn't justify the terrorism against against Israelis by Hamas or anything like that. But when you understand that this has been going on for decades, it becomes a lot more understandable why they would want to act out in violence. It doesn't stop you from condemning it, but it does make you understand more where they're coming from.
I think just on that subject real quick, uh, one of the things to sort of understand that I think would be useful is just to sort of talk about the sorry it sort of gets back to what I had said initially of sort of we've seen how this sort of thing goes and we can see how it's going to go in the future, and like history can teach us, history can give us guidance as to what's going on and what could or could not happen and how we could try to break the cycle of violence. And a lot of that is things like look, as PZ had talked about with South Africa, I'm currently living in Ireland, and the issues with British colonialism in Ireland are, I think, fairly well known. And it's something that also comes up if you ever like look into people who think that the US is in some kind of danger of being invaded by China or the Russia or whoever the boogeyman of the day is. And it's very clear that no matter where you go in the world, no matter what people you're looking at, if you present a group of people with some form of occupation and oppression, terrorism will result from that. And you don't need to, like, it's nothing to do with condoning it. This is what people do. People result to they result to whatever means to resist they have. I think that's part of why the UN, sort of in terms of human rights law, says that like people who are under occupation have a right to fight that occupation with whatever means they have to hand. And this is like, it's such a reliable human instinct. The early Zionists knew that that would happen with Palestinians fighting back as their land, if their land was taken. It was very clear when the United States sort of took over from Britain as Israel's primary kind of protector, that again, the project, the Israeli project as it exists, is something that is always going to require military enforcement, right up until, I guess, you get to the point where what remains of the Palestinian population is the diaspora internationally, and basically a reservation or two, like the United States has done to Native Americans. And there's, especially given sort of, as PZ had said, the hostile surroundings, like there is no military path to peace. And that's not just like, oh, we can't stomach it. It's that there really isn't. It's just not possible to shoot your way to peace in this situation. Like, this isn't something where, like, you know, there's the whole region is sort of watching and sympathetic and has been affected by the existence of Israel in its current form. And so, like, if you want peace, if you want safety for Jewish people living in Israel, it needs to be a commitment to actual peace, because we know what happens when you try to pursue what Israel is trying to pursue, and it is always violence all the way through. It's there's no victory state here. Stop ranting on that.
Well, no, I'll pick
And
up what you're.
I think I was going to say, I think the path to peace has to involve some kind of accommodation with the people living there, that you have to be willing
Yeah.
to share power. And Israel so far is not willing to grant any rights to Palestinians at all.
Well, and
I
it's
guess
interesting.
one other thing
No, go ahead.
I'd just just to sort of since we're talking solutions, like I in terms of policy towards Israel as it exists, I'm very much of the opinion that countries like the United States, Britain, Germany ought to stop their military support for this Israeli project. I think that if it came to an actual effort for peace, then we absolutely should provide military support for, like, there have now been generations of bad blood, even if you sort of ignore what led us to this situation. And as with any other situation like this, if we sort of declared tomorrow what I think ought to happen is a democratic state with equal rights for all, there would be people wanting to restart the violence. There would be those looking for revenge. There would be those looking to restart the Zionist sort of colonial project of clearing the land for Israel to use as it sees fit. And so you would need an international peacekeeping force or something like that to sort of provide a buffer and take time to sort of build up the infrastructure and sort of economic stability of Palestine, and give people time to heal from the trauma that they've been through on both sides, and give people time to sort of sit back and sort of rethink, like, oh, maybe there's another possibility here. But there's no way where the violence just turns off. And so there is going to be a period of time, assuming we go the route towards peace, where there is terrorism from both sides. There is just spontaneous fights breaking out where people interact, where there's no longer an apartheid. It's not going to be an easy process. It's not going to be a bloodless process, but it's a process that actually has hope for peace and for people to actually be able to live in dignity and to create something new. And that, I think, is worth an international investment. And that would be a good use of all of this. Hesitate to say a good use of this machinery of war, but it would be a thing that we could actually do as an international community to help move things in a better direction. And I think if we got there, that would probably say good things about where we were headed with other regions of the world as well, and our ability to actually try something other than just violent domination as a solution to problems, but by nations. So,
And it's worked in the past too.
yeah,
Ironically enough, it was Ronald Reagan who, at one point during the Israel-Palestine conflict, thought things were getting out of hand and stepped in and sort of gave a hard line to the Israeli government to, okay, cut this out. You're going too far. If you keep going further, we're going to cut aid from you. And it worked. The Israeli state is really heavily dependent on aid from the United States in particular, to a lesser extent from the globe itself. If the US actually wanted to end the conflict, they could put quite a bit of pressure on the Israeli state themselves and, make things substantially better. It's been done. It can be done.
well, that's one of my well, I'm not alone in this. It is one of the frustrations with Biden that sort of everybody paying attention to the issue is aware of. I It's no secret to my readers that I listen to the Majority Report fairly often, and they've sort of dug into his history on the issue before, and you've got just a whole bunch of statements throughout most of his political career, perhaps all of it. I haven't followed it that closely myself, sort of being very aggressive in his support for Zion, Israel as it exists. And it's been remarked that, like, he has done less to restrain this genocidal impulse of the Israeli government, of the Israeli right wing, than pretty much any other president in history, in the history of all this. And it's sort of remarkable how he's pretending that he has no power to influence what happens there, and it's just out of his hands. And he's just the most powerful man in the world, and the person who, short of probably Netanyahu, has the most influence over Israeli policy in this regard. And he's been pretending that he has just no say at all, nothing to do with it, while continuing to just supply them with everything they want militarily. I also have anger about this issue.
This is again one of the reasons why I sort of push for this. It's a great way to sort of get this off our chest and be like, okay, these are our views. This is what we think of the situation, potentially how we can actually improve or help it as well. So, one of my impetuses for pushing for this podcast. All right, we've done a recording for about an hour or so, and I could probably easily, do like maybe half an hour on Jabotinsky. I could crush it down to 10 if you really want, or if you're tired, we can also just leave with Brinkman, because Jabotinsky, while very sort of illuminating of how the Israeli state currently, behaves and acts, is a downer. Like, you thought things were bad with Herzl, you ain't seen nothing yet. So, if you don't mind hanging out for 10 minutes, I can do that. If not, we'll just close with Brinkman and, then a final round of shoutouts.
Yeah, I think we should not strain the patience of our viewers and keep this as short as we can, because there's no way we can deal with it adequately. We could go on for weeks and we would not address this problem properly. So I say let's just let Brinkman have his say. That's a good way to end out. And maybe we'll come back to this in a future podcast.
Yeah. And if you want a preview of what that potential podcast might look at, there's the two last citations I've got are on Jabotinsky himself. One from somebody who's actually, I think, hired by the Jabotinsky Institute to sort of look into his past, and I think even has a relation to Jabotinsky proper. And there's also a second thing which actually touches on something that Abe brought up related to colonization, sort of to give you a feel for how Jabotinsky thought about, what the Zionists actually were doing in there. Spoilers, he was totally like, yeah, this is a colonial project. And, I'm not ashamed to say it, essentially.
It occurs to me we should also probably link to those two chapters from Naomi Klein.
Oh, yes. I'll add that into the... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I'll add that into this show notes. Essentially, the YouTube video description and all that.
Okay.
So
for those listening for those listening who aren't aware, in Naomi Klein's book Doppelganger, She discusses this issue in, I think, the 13th and 14th chapters. And because of the relevance of it right at this moment, she and her publisher made those 2 chapters free, put them up for free online. So we'll have the link in the down there part, and it's worth checking out. Klein does good work and is worth paying attention to, and these 2 chapters are no exception.
All right. With that, then, I shall cede the floor to Brinkman. So, back in a couple of minutes.
Hey, I'm William Brinkman. I run the Bolingbrook Babbler blog on Free Thought Blogs. I've also been involved in the humanistic Judaism community for over 10 years, and when I was a college activist, I worked with Palestinian students regarding Palestine. And sorry I couldn't make this panel discussion. I would have loved to have contributed, but my schedule didn't work out. So just want to leave with a couple points. First of all, these 2 points really should be obvious. Harassing people of Jewish background or belief is not social justice. It's being a jerk. You are not helping the people, residents of Gaza in any way. And despite what some people will say, not all Jewish people have control over the state of Israel. The state of Israel is a country. And in fact, there are people of Jewish heritage or belief that are quite critical of what Israel's doing, especially right now. And correlate to that, you're harassing Arab Americans will not bring the hostages home and will not protect the state of Israel or protect Jewish people. It's just being a jerk. And sorry I have to say that, but the organization I'm with, we're having to worry about security, which is something I'm kind of new to this, and it's really appalling to think that we have to plan for doxing or active shooter event, and that goes for the Muslim community as well. And it's bad. And I'll just conclude by saying, I guess regardless of whether you support a independent Palestine, a 2-state solution, 1-state solution, or some type of variation, what's going on in Gaza is an atrocity. You can call it genocide if you want, or reckless disregard of civilian life, but there needs to be a ceasefire, and it has to stop. The situation cannot be solved by shooting, by war, violence. And it's complicated how we got to this point, but it needs to stop. There needs to be a ceasefire.
All right. And Brinkman blogs over at the Boiling Book Babbler. I think he has a couple of books out as well, too, so definitely check them out. I apologize. I probably should have memorized what their titles were, but I forgot that. All right, let's do some social media shoutouts then. PZ, where can they find you?
Oh, on my blog, of course, but also I'm on, let's see, where am I? There's all the, I'm not on Twitter anymore. Sorry, I've left that, so too bad. But I'm on Mastodon at octodon.social, and I'm on Blue Sky now, and I'm also on Threads, and I'm always just PZ Myers for a username on all of those, so you should be able to find me.
All right, Abe, let's get your handle as well. Handles.
I'm at Abe Drayton. I'm still, out of morbid curiosity or habit, still on Twitter. But I'm also on Blue Sky and Mastodon, I think on Universidon. But it's still at Abe Drayton, and of course Oceanoxia.
And I'm H.J. Hornbeck. I've got a blog over at Reprobate Spreadsheet. I'm actually just about to publish on a sort of a retrospective of what happened during a recent network outage. It's probably going to be a two-parter, but it'll at least give you some nice juicy technical details on that. Ironic enough, still don't have any plans to blog about this, but it'll come. Don't worry about it. Don't worry. I also have a Mastodon account as well too. H.J. Hornbeck at Free Thought Online. There's a secondary account too. It's pretty quiet. And yeah, that's the best spot to sort of find me there. So I think with that, we're sort of we've final things up. We might do another thing on this in future if there's enough requests for it. If not, then we'll see you later with our next topic that we'll discuss. So see you later.